Hey there guys, this is your host Richard with another marvelous video. Daredevil has held a special place in Marvel Comics for being the first blind superhero, who's also a religiously conflicted character. While the original Daredevil swims the oceans of obscurity, the same can't be said for the version that Frank Miller wrote. Daredevil's Born Again arc by Mr. Miller has him descent into madness while facing destitution at the hands of Kingpin, while trying to build himself a new life. Of course, the upcoming 2025 Daredevil TV series borrows its name from Born Again. So, without spending any more time, let's long read the marvelously exciting story where the man without fear rebuilds himself from scratch. Prelude to Death. The story of Born Again is one that begins toward the end of an era for Daredevil. But before we get there, let's start with the opening panel of this arc, which features Melvin Potter discouragingly going through a robbery at a jewelry store. He blames someone else for this, saying they made him do it. He knows he shouldn't do it, but he's a little confused, and he has to think about Betsy, his love, who we later learn is being taken hostage. Elsewhere, Gloriana O'Brien makes her way to the law office of Nelson and Murdock to give Matthew Murdock a piece of her mind. However, when she enters the office, she discovers that there's an air of gloom around. Foggy Nelson explains to her that they're closing up shop and they're in the process of moving out of the building. He asks Gloriana if she came here for Matt. She's even more disappointed to realize that Matt isn't here today of all days either. Just then, Becky Blake comes in with a radio and informs the pair that Melvin Potter is out robbing again. Foggy notes that Melvin used to be a client of theirs and he wasn't evil, just sick in the head. He swears that Melvin can't be back in crime unless someone is framing him. He apologizes to the ladies for ranting, and Gloriana suggests they go to dinner to talk about the state of Matthew's mind. On a rooftop in Hell's Kitchen, Matt Murdock sits in contemplation wearing his Daredevil costume. He wonders about how long he's been Daredevil and laments the fact that he thinks he's in good shape for someone who's barely 30. He complains in his head about all the blame everyone puts on him, and he remembers his old mentor. Stick said to him that there's two sides to him, one that studies and reads, and one that trains and fights. He points out, however, that the problem is neither of them sides yours, in that he just does what everyone else tells him, whether it's his dad, the women in his life, or Stick himself. That way, Stick concludes that Matt always has someone else to blame if something goes wrong, but it's also why Matt can't be what he could be. A rushing police car pulls his attention, and he focuses his hearing on the car radio that mentions Melvin Potter being on the run. Matt's disappointed and upset, wondering if Melvin has betrayed him too, especially after everything he's done for the man. Regardless, he wears his mask and jumps to action. Meanwhile, Betsy Beatty is tied up to a chair in an unknown apartment. She tries her best to look out the window and finds a landmark she can use to locate herself. She tries to remember everything about dealing with sociopaths and tries to reason with the kidnappers, but ends up being punched hard and falls to the ground. While the kidnappers are discussing the next course of action, Betsy gets a peek through the window and sees the Chrysler building, allowing her to get an idea of her location. However, she's immediately taped on the mouth. In another dingy apartment, Melvin takes a 4-hour-long shower and waits for further instructions from the kidnappers. Later, Daredevil reaches Melvin's shop and sneaks inside, only to find some thieves trying to rob the place. He deduces that they're no friends of Melvin, but they'll do, and proceeds to kick the snot out of them. He tries to interrogate one of them for information on Melvin but learns nothing. Subsequently, he decides he can't waste all night on Melvin and heads to his office to clear out his debts. At a restaurant, Foggy and Gloriana discuss their troubles, including Gloriana's heartbreak over Matt ghosting her. She apologizes for troubling Foggy with her problems while he's already in the middle of so many problems, but he says he doesn't mind and asks her to go for a walk. In the night, Matt breaks into his office wearing his costume and thinks about all the stuff he went through as a lawyer. He admits that he wasn't really interested in being one, but only did it because of his dad. He thinks about his childhood and in a fit of rage takes his name plaque and smashes the office window with it, prompting the alarm to go off. He says, let it ring all night. Foggy and Gloriana walk the Columbia University campus as he recounts an incident from his and Matt's college days when Matt managed to save Foggy from a frat bully, although Foggy to this day has no idea how. He also mentions that he never noticed how romantic the place looks at night, with which Gloriana seems to agree. Matt arrives back to his apartment but only finds one message from Gloriana, that too incomplete. He then gets a call from Melvin asking Matt for Daredevil's help. Matt is still upset about the betrayal, and so he jumps back into action ready to kick Melvin's ass. After reaching the museum, the two fight, and Matt uses his super hearing and quick thinking to beat Melvin using a pillar. Melvin, defeated, tells Daredevil about Betsy and how he's being blackmailed. Daredevil feels ashamed for assuming the worst and agrees to help him. Daredevil sends Melvin home and goes investigating. Once he figures out where the kidnappers are located, he calls Melvin, and the two of them bust into the place and take out the kidnappers with ease. Once Betsy's safe, Matt watches Melvin and her walk out safely. He ends the issue on a solemn note, saying, "They leave. I'm alone. My knuckles are bleeding." Kingpin's Grand Plan. The second issue and the true beginning of the born-again story arc begins with Karen Page sitting in a dusty office on a hot summer day. She offers up Daredevil's secret identity and an envelope for some drugs because she's become an addict after her acting career didn't pan out and she ended up doing adult films for money. The man she gives the identity to takes it up the chain until it eventually lands up in Kingpin's hands. He's on a ship with his associates, who all leave once the subject of Daredevil is brought up. Wesley stays and Kingpin tells him to locate every person who knows of this envelope and kill them. In the meantime, he plans to test this information. After that, there's a 6-month time jump. We see Matt Murdock in bed one winter morning in New York. The accompanying text box explains who he is and why his life is about to fall apart because of it. Currently, Matt is slightly depressed and out of a job, recovering from his injuries sustained during his crime fighting. He checks through his mail expecting offers from law firms for a new job but is disappointed to find only bills. A tape from his girlfriend, a notice from the bank telling him he's late on mortgage payments, and a letter from the IRS telling him that he's being audited and all his assets are frozen for now. As he listens to the tape, which reveals that Gloriana is breaking up with him, he also learns from his accountant that there's trouble with his finances and that he doesn't have an accountant anymore. He also receives a subpoena for a grand jury hearing. When he talks to a friend, he learns that Police Lieutenant Nicholas Manolis, who has an impeccable record, testified that he saw Murdock pay a witness to perjure himself. Later at night, Foggy walks into Gloriana's apartment to find everything in there scattered and upturned. Gloriana is in the middle of that mess crying about how much she hates this city and Foggy comforts her. In another part of town, Robbie Robertson hands an assignment to Ben Urich regarding Matt Murdock facing a host of different charges. Urich, whose life Matt once saved, calls up his friend to check on him, but the voice on the other end just dismisses him and hangs up. Matt is at his desk. The text box is explaining that he called the banks about the payments which he made on time. The bank was unhelpful, and right now, nothing else seems to be going his way either. Then he pulls out the Daredevil costume and goes out into the snowy cold night, saying that it's the only part of my life worth living anymore. Foggy and Gloriana sit by a fire at Foggy's apartment, where he's comforting her. She says she felt like she didn't have a friend in the world, but now with Foggy, she feels good. They briefly hold hands and Foggy quickly tells them it's time for bed, insisting that he'll sleep on the couch. Meanwhile, Daredevil breaks into Nick Manolis' apartment and asks him why he's lying. He can smell the cop's guilt and presses him until they end up in a fight, but Daredevil leaves soon enough. Nick makes a call and says Daredevil showed up and asks for his son to get the treatment he needs now. Daredevil eavesdrops on this conversation, but he can't make out who's on the other end. He figures that someone's out to get Matt Murdock and goes home because it's the only place he feels safe. He tries to make dinner but finds his power cut off. He goes to call about it and his phone has been disconnected. He goes to bed, claiming, it's been a day. The next morning, Foggy wakes up to the smell of bacon, eggs, and pancakes. Gloriana's cooking breakfast and he thinks that she's an angel. Matt calls and Foggy learns everything that's been happening to him. The next few weeks, we learn, go terribly for him, as Kingpin monitors the progress on his plan to frame Matt Murdock for crimes he didn't commit. By day, we and the Kingpin see Matt struggling to form a defense for himself, and by night, we see him becoming more and more erratic, until one fateful night he barges into a bar and screams about information on Murdock, but finds nothing. Kingpin explains how carefully he's laid out his plan so that no one knows more than scraps of information, and how he plans to weaken the Daredevil and drive him to insanity. The trial goes about as well as could be hoped, and although Matt doesn't face a prison sentence, he loses his license to practice law, faces poverty and public shame, and as Kingpin explains, survival will become his only concern. Even so, Kingpin wonders if he could hire Matt down the line, use a man of such talents as an asset to his enterprise. He decides not to tamper with the misery that awaits him. After the trial, Foggy tries apologizing to Matt, but Matt tells him that he did his job well and avoided a prison sentence. They hug and part ways. Karen, still helpless and an addict, runs into the killers sent by Kingpin. She escapes and thinks of the only person who can help her, Matt. Meanwhile, Matt walks the snowy streets of New York, assessing his options and trying to figure out what to do next. As he comes to his house, the building blows up. Matt is shaken. However, this act allows him to figure out that Kingpin is behind this. The issue ends on an ominous note where Matt, holding his torn costume, says, "It was a nice piece of work, Kingpin. You shouldn't have signed it." No more life. The issue begins with Foggy and Gloriana O'Brien at their apartment, where Foggy tries to screw in a light bulb. No, this isn't the start of a joke. Foggy fumbles it, and Gloriana gets a call which leaves her shocked. She reveals that it was Matt, and he wasn't making any sense. As for Matt, we see him lying in bed inside a cramped apartment. He's got $10 to his name. All his stuff is burned down, and his public image has been destroyed. He groggily wakes up, trying to piece together how his life fell apart so quickly. He wonders at first if he's going insane, but then remembers that this is all Kingpin's doing. Matt vows to go to the Kingpin and beat him senseless until he promises to restore Matt's life to what it was. In another part of the town, Kingpin has brought together the city's crime gangs to create an efficient business. He thinks of what a pain Murdock has been and how much he's enjoying torturing the man. It's only a matter of time, he thinks, before Murdock goes mad, and he thinks of how wonderful it is to be alive. Matt is still in his bed, listening to the sounds of the city. He can't sleep, so he decides he might as well get up and get some breakfast. After that, he decides he'll pay Kingpin a visit. He lays out his whole plan, and we see Matt standing over Kingpin's bloodied body, but it's revealed that it was just a dream. He calls Gloriana again and hangs up when Foggy tries to talk to him. Just then, he hears steps outside his door. The hotel manager opens the door, and Matt immediately assaults him, then walks out of there to confront Kingpin. It's unclear if he's thinking straight. At Kingpin's gym, Wesley reports on Murdock's activities as Kingpin works out. Wesley recounts that on the subway, Matt didn't try to help any of the passengers who were being robbed, that is, until someone pointed a gun at him. After that, Murdock went on a rampage and beat everyone viciously, including a police officer. Kingpin says that's perfect, and he knows that Matt is on his way to confront him. Matt calls Foggy from a public phone and tells him he might be sick because he beat up a cop and everyone around him is working for Kingpin, trying to ruin his life. He finds himself convinced that he should visit Kingpin, and we find out as he leaves that there's no one on the other end of the phone call. Meanwhile, Karen tries to contact Matt from a phone at a bar, but the operator tells her the line has been disconnected. She wonders what happened to Matt and tries to find him in the directory, but before she can, she has to run away from Kingpin's assassin. Elsewhere, Ben Urich tries to convince J. Jonah Jameson that Matt has been framed by the Kingpin, but Jameson doesn't buy it. In Gloriana's apartment, Glory and Foggy anxiously wait for Matt to call again. Karen's still on the run, tired and afraid, aiming to get to New York because she knows that's where Matt is always going to be. While all this stage setting is happening, Matt finally makes his way to Kingpin's home gym. They go head-to-head. Matt even uses a stolen billy club to attack Kingpin and makes him bleed. Kingpin only smiles through it all and proceeds to beat Matt to a pulp. After this near-death defeat, Kingpin refrains from giving in to his bloodlust and killing him right there and then. Instead, Matt's put into a stolen cab and driven off Pier 41 into the East River. The doors and windows of the cab are corroded shut. Matt's soaked in whiskey, and the cab's owner has been beaten to death by Murdock's stolen billy club. Weeks go by, and Kingpin is always thinking about what Matt's last moments must have been like in that cab, struggling to escape and failing. He feels triumphant about taking Murdock down in the worst possible way. At last, however, the cab is found. There's evidence of a struggle, a broken windshield, a safety belt cut by glass, and most importantly, no corpse. Kingpin mulls this fact over and over again. There's no corpse. On the last page of the panel, we see Matt Murdock, barely alive, hanging on by a thread, walking into an alley full of garbage and homeless people. Matt's life may have been taken away, but alas, he isn't dead yet. The only question that remains is, what will he do next? A walk down memory lane. Issue number 229 of Daredevil takes a different approach to the story, in that it gives readers a deep dive into the hero's origins. We start with Matt on the verge of dying, talking about how he never believed life flashes before a person's eyes right before death. However, he sees visions of his last day of sight. We see him save an old man from an oncoming truck. In the process, a radioactive material is spilled from the same truck and Matt's eyesight is exposed to it. After that, we see narration from Matt against a black background of everything he goes through. The way his body and blood change due to the radiation, the way his senses are heightened. He remembers being wheeled away to the hospital, pumped full of drugs to dull his senses, and how they cut his face up in an effort to save him. He remembers that the anesthesia doesn't work anymore, and he can feel everything. He screams and writhes in pain, but it only makes things worse. After a while, he learns to control himself, even though the agony continues. His senses detect whiskey and a loud voice calling to him. It turns out to be his father, who tells him he's a hero. When he finally leaves, Matt is alone for the night, trying to survive these newfound heightened senses. A voice comes to him and asks him how he's feeling. He tells her how much pain he's in, and she tells him that it might not necessarily be a bad thing. She tells him to keep his new powers a secret and asks him to promise that he'll use them for good. Matt senses a cross around the woman's neck as she kisses his forehead. He calms down eventually with a newfound sense of hope from the strange woman. His dad comes to visit him later. He breaks the news of Matt's blindness as best he can and is surprised to see that Matt is handling it rather well. Matt thinks to himself that it's because he's made a promise, and we cut back to the present day as Matt's sleeping in the garbage in an alley with other homeless people. He recounts the rest of his life, how he kept his powers secret from his father, how he found Stick to train him, how he became a crime fighter, and how Kingpin eventually learned of his secret identity took everything away from him and, well, killed him. Now, around Christmas time in uptown New York, Foggy and Gloria are walking with a bunch of bags. Foggy complains about how he should have finished all of this earlier, but Gloria reminds him all the job offers and other work he's had to deal with. Life seems to be going well for them, but a random snatcher tries to steal Gloria's bag. She fights back, and after a bowling ball to the face from Foggy, the snatcher runs away. They again state what a horrible city this is, so much so that none of the passing people even tried helping them. Elsewhere, Ben Urich goes to Bellevue to visit Officer Nick Manolis, whose kid is undergoing treatment there for a rare heart disease. He confronts Nick about going corrupt after more than 20 years of spotless service to frame Matt Murdock, all so that his son could receive the proper treatment. Manolis doesn't admit to any wrongdoing, and Urich asks how the kid is. Manolis responds, "Complications. Going under the knife in an hour. Could die tonight." In between these scenes, we see glimpses of a broken Murdock mustering the strength to get up and keep moving. Similarly, we see Karen Page stumbling through the streets of Mexico, trying to find a way to make it back to New York. Matt staggers through oncoming traffic until he gets hit by a car. Nobody comes to help him, but he manages to pick himself up and keeps moving. Intercut with these scenes, we also see Foggy talking to his mom about Matt, but also about Gloriana and how he's found a nice girl. Matt comes across Turk and his accomplice stealing a volunteer Santa costume. Something in him snaps and he tells them to stop. Turk tries to buy him off, but it doesn't work, so he ends up stabbing Matt and running away. Matt says he feels his broken ribs tearing him up from the inside, but he must keep moving anyway. We then also learn that Officer Manolis' son didn't survive the operation. They walk out to the parking lot with a nurse following them. Karen eventually gets in touch with a shady gangster who's a fan of her adult films. She agrees to give him company in exchange for a trip to New York. Kingpin's assassins catch up to them just then, and the gangster shoots them down, then warns her, "You better be worth this." Back in New York, Matt finds himself back in Hell's Kitchen, trying to figure out the way back to his dad's old place, which he thinks is the only safe place left for him. Meanwhile, Foggy gifts Gloriana an expensive necklace, after which the two kiss. Matt finds that his dad's old home has been torn down, leaving only rubble. He thinks then of going to his dad's old gym. Outside Bellevue's parking lot, Urich and Manolis are coming to terms with the officer's son's death. Manolis agrees to share information, but before he can, the nurse who's been keeping tabs on them comes out and decks Manolis. She reveals that she works for Kingpin and warns Urich not to pursue this any further. As punishment, she breaks Urich's fingers and then makes him watch as she tortures Manolis. We see Matt at his dad's gym, reminiscing about his days of sneaking in here and training. He thinks of how he became a fighter here, just like his dad. He now declares that every other part of me is dead, only the fighter lives. He throws a couple of punches at the punching bag, but is so exhausted that he ends up passing out there. We then see the shadow of a nun approaching him, wearing a gold cross. She calls out to Matt. The following page is a beautifully biblical panel of her holding Matt in her arms. Then, the last page of the issue shows Kingpin, still working out, but he can't stop thinking about the fact that there's no corpse. He comes to the conclusion that Matt is indeed still alive and that the way he's been broken has now shown him that he's perhaps more. In Kingpin's own words, he says, "I've shown him that a man without hope is a man without fear." That's where the issue ends, signaling that the titular born-again part of the story is coming soon. Finding Matt Murdock. Matthew Murdock's life may have ended in all the ways that matter, which is perhaps why the titular issue of this story arc begins with him clinically dying. We open on Matt flatlining, dreaming about the events that kicked off this whole phase of his life. He remembers how Kingpin beat him to a pulp and realizes that wasn't a dream. Then, a heartbeat. He comes back to life. We see him splashed on the next page, posing in Jesus imagery, as the nun who saved his life thanks God he's alive. In the meantime, Karen has made it back to America with Paolo Scorsese. She thinks of Matt. On the other end, Kingpin is training in his gym, but he too is constantly thinking about Matt. Of course, the problem is no one knows where Matt is, and that includes Matt. In happier news, we see Foggy get a job with a good salary and is happy with Gloriana, although the pair is worried about Matt, who's been missing for more than 11 days. We also see the aftermath of what the nurse did to Urich and Officer Manolis, who now lies brutalized in that hospital parking lot. At Penn Station, Paolo and Karen share a long kiss. For her, it's a final payment for getting safe passage back to New York and nothing more. However, for Paolo, it isn't enough. Meanwhile, Kingpin asks Wesley to get in touch with Nuke for an important job. Matt is still incapacitated. However, he's received care and is recovering slowly, even if painfully. His hearing comes back to full strength, which he uses to locate himself. He deduces that he's in a church basement and tries to get up and away. However, it turns out his legs don't work yet, and the nun who saved him comes in and puts him back in bed and tells him to stay. She introduces herself as Maggie. Karen calls Foggy and arranges to meet up with him. As she tries to leave, Paolo hits her and says she better come back because she belongs to him now. At the Daily Bugle, Jameson confronts Urich and asks him to write about Kingpin so that they can take him down. However, Urich doesn't say anything, and as he leaves Jameson's office, he's threatened by another one of Kingpin's men who works as a cleaner at the Bugle. Later, during work, he gets a call from a recovering Officer Manolis who says he's ready to expose the Kingpin by telling his story. Yorick turns him down, but Manolis presses him. Yorick doesn't seem to budge, and just then, the nurse comes back and makes Yorick listen on a call as she strangles Manolis to death. Yorick is mortified. Kingpin is at a party, worrying about finding Nuke. He thinks about having to go through so many hoops so many days to find this one guy. He thinks about having a general in his pocket and how that relationship must be nurtured. His goal behind getting Nuke is to use him to draw Murdock out of hiding. He also plans something by making a call to a psychiatrist and requesting a psychotic person to be recruited. Meanwhile, Karen meets up with Foggy and he fills her in on everything that's happened to Matt. He also notices the bruise marks on her face and she tells him about Paolo. Foggy tells her that she shouldn't go back to him and that she can stay with him instead. Ben Yorick is still in shock about Manolis' murder, reliving the events in his head. He goes through life in a catatonic stage until he finds himself on a park bench where he finally removes his handcast and utters Matt Murdock's name for the first time in days. While all this is happening, we also see that Matt is running a high fever. Maggie thinks that he's lost too much blood and he can't fight. She asks God to save him. His soul may be troubled, but it's a good man's soul. She asks the Lord to spare him, even if her soul is damned for her past sins. She thinks that if only he could be shown the way, he could become a spear of lightning that would clean up this poisoned city. Later, Kingpin's men visit Melvin Potter's shop for a job. The men ask Melvin to create a uniform that he's quite familiar with. They tell Melvin that if he doesn't make this costume for them, then they'll hurt him quite badly. In the end, they reveal that the costume he's to make should be a perfect duplicate of the uniform of the man without fear, Daredevil. On the last page of the issue, we see that Matt's fever has now broken, and he's returning to normal. He thinks about how a heartbeat can tell you a lot about a person. He listens to how his own heart has slowed down since the fever broke, and how the hearts around him are beating. Maggie's heart, for instance, is in good shape and has relaxed a lot now that Matt's okay. He also recognizes a scent from all those years ago, and it's a scent that feels familiar to him. Finally, he asks her, "Are you my mother?" Maggie denies the assumption with a smile. However, Matt notices that her heartbeat just jumped. He realizes that she's lying, and that's where the issue ends. By the looks of it, Matt is taking this surprisingly well. Seeing double. This issue of the Born Again story arc begins with Matt back on his feet, now training in his dad's old gym. As he goes through his routine, we see intercut with it a meeting Fisk is having with his board members. The board members are happy to see that crime and, in turn, their profits are on the rise. However, one member, Mr. Switzer, asks Kingpin about why he's been allocating funds for a personal vendetta against Matt Murdock. He says he doesn't mind it, he'd simply like an explanation. Clearly, this transgression doesn't go lightly with Fisk, as he dilutes all of Mr. Switzer's shares in the company and asks him to accept it or his family dies. For good measure, he also asks Wesley to arrange an accident for Switzer where he would break both his legs. At the Daily Bugle, Yorick is spilling all the information he's found and events he's witnessed about Officer Manolis, Kingpin's men, and the framing of Matt Murdock. He refrains from telling them about Matt's extraordinary abilities, but that's more for the readers than anyone else. He's unaware of the fact that Matt's now back and following Yorick. Meanwhile, the nurse who killed Manolis, named Lois, finds out that she's being relocated to Arizona, which pisses her off. When Yorick arrives home, he's attacked by Nurse Lois, who'd been waiting inside for him. She gained access to the home by telling Mrs. Yorick that her husband was in danger. In the ensuing struggle, Yorick notices that his wife has been hung from the bathroom ceiling. Luckily, Matt comes in and fights with Doris, giving Yorick time to cut the rope and save his wife. He comes out of the bathroom to see Lois cuffed and incapacitated. He realizes Matt is alive. Just then, he gets a call from Melvin Potter, who says he read Ben's article in the Bugle and because of it, he needs to talk to him. He says it's about Daredevil and a matter of life and death. Yorick blows him off, however, because he's still in shock about the attack on him and his wife in their own home. Matt eavesdrops on this call and decides to investigate. Meanwhile, Kingpin goes to an asylum and chooses his psychopath for the upcoming job. Matt goes to Potter's and learns about the Daredevil costume they ordered him to make. Melvin is hesitant to do this, especially after everything Daredevil's done for him in the past. He's relieved then to hear Daredevil's voice from the shadows, who assures him that no one will be hurt even if he makes the costume. Back at Foggy's apartment, Karen is suffering through withdrawal from her drug addiction. She goes to the window for some air and sees Paolo down on the street, looking at her. Scared, she tells Foggy, and he calls the police. Back with Matt, he's riding stealthily on the roof of the car with the psychopath and Kingpin's goon in it. The psychopath receives instructions and the Daredevil costume in order to impersonate him and kill Foggy Nelson and anyone else who happens to be in his apartment. To their dismay, the cops show up at Nelson's apartment and get into a shootout with Paolo. They relay this information to the Kingpin, who tells them to kill anyone who tries to leave the building. He thinks this is as good as a plan as any because his rented psychopath in the Daredevil costume will be spotted. To no one's surprise, the psychopath isn't the most reliable and he beats up Kingpin's goons but proceeds to the roof to get to Foggy's flat. Meanwhile, Karen knocks Foggy out and goes down to the street. She believes that going back to Paolo will keep Foggy safe. The psychopath tries to get into the building through the the roof but is instead faced with a punch from Matt through the door. They fight on the roof as Karen goes to Paolo and asks to talk. Paolo starts beating Karen up, but they're interrupted by more of Kingpin's men who have been ordered to kill both of them. Back on the roof, Matt's able to incapacitate the psychopath and then goes to save Karen. Paolo gets shot by Kingpin's men, but instead of quietly dying, he decides to shoot Karen too. Karen, who believes there's no way out, is about to take a shot of heroin so she won't feel the bullet. Matt makes it just in time though and takes out Kingpin's men with his billy club. In a heartwarming ending to the whole affair, Matt and Karen finally embrace. On the last page of the issue, the epilogue explains that police found 5 bodies near Foggy's apartment. The psychopath is found naked and alive. The 2 henchmen employed by Kingpin are found dead and are expected to cause trouble for Kingpin's attorneys in the coming months. The other 2 bodies are the 2 police officers who were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Lastly, Martin Kemp and Paolo Scorsese are arrested while fleeing the scene, both facing long sentences. This is revealed to be a report by Ben Urich, who in the end vows to stick to being a reporter and find out where Matt Murdock is and what he's become. Waiting in the shadows. This and the following issue act as the rebuilding arc that follows the Born Again storyline. However, it begins with a different character. We're introduced to Frank Simpson, aka Nuke, who's in Nicaragua doing commando stuff. He shoots up the militants while napalm is deployed all around. In the end, he manages to stack up a body count of close to 100. His super abilities seem to work on red and white pills that he takes to supercharge and then cool down. After this assignment's done, his handler tells him that he's going to New York for his next job. Turns out, the general has some new friends who need a task completed. The general is, of course, in Kingpin's pocket. Kingpin's obsessed with killing Matt Murdock at this point. He plans to aim Nuke directly at Murdock. As for Matt, he's moved into a derelict apartment with Karen. Karen's still suffering from withdrawals, but Matt's able to help her with recovery because of his heightened senses. He can hold her, help her sleep, and say exactly what needs to be said in order to keep her calm and safe. Later, at a park, Ben Urich's investigation into Kingpin's activities and Matt's disappearances brings him to Foggy Nelson. Foggy offers to be interviewed only if it's going to help. He knows Matt spoke highly of Ben, which is why he tells Urich about all that occurred with Matt's case. He talks about how the charges were false, how the jury was tampered with, how false evidence was presented, and how all of it slowly broke Matt. He tries to show Urich what he's got in terms of appealing Matt's case, but a gust of wind blows away the documents. As the two collect them, Urich sees pictures taken by Gloriana. He asks Foggy to tell Gloriana that she should call him. He ends up hiring her as a photographer. Kingpin finds out from the commissioner that Nurse Lois plans on talking to Urich soon, which poses a problem. Kingpin blackmails the commissioner into keeping Officer Coogan on duty during the interview. Meanwhile, Matt wakes up early, shaves, and goes to his new job at a diner, which he quite enjoys. Karen stays in bed next to the Daredevil costume and wonders why Matt is hesitating. She recalls him pacing every night, hesitant to even touch the costume. She used to worry before when he would go out as Daredevil, but now he's changed. She senses something new and frightening inside him, but since he's still Matt, she goes back to sleep. At the city jail, Ben and Glory go to Lois's cell to hear her side of the story. However, before she can reveal anything, Coogan and the other officer pull out the guns and kill Lois and Ben's assistant in the cell. The other officer is shot too, and Ben intervenes and takes the gun and bashes Coogan's head in as Gloria gets all the events on film. Nuke reaches New York, and the Kingpin feeds him a whole story about his own son being a veteran and how he's a patriot. He does a whole song and dance about America and capitalism and free enterprise, how the troops are disrespected and how there are those who think America is evil. The whole point of the charade is to get Nuke riled up and point him at Hell's Kitchen. We see a normal day in Hell's Kitchen, and Matt living a peaceful life at the diner. He likes cooking for the people of this part of New York, and the people at the diner seem to really care for him. He overhears Urich at the diner talking about the trauma of killing Coogan, but also about everything else he's found in his investigation so far. As Matt leaves the diner, he hears a military helicopter approaching. In a climactic ambush, scores of civilians are killed as Nuke destroys the diner and starts shooting innocent civilians. Nuke employs heavy weaponry, and Matt is heavily affected due to his increased senses as he can hear about all the casualties caused each time Nuke's guns are fired. Among those casualties, he also finds Karen, lying in the rubble of a destroyed building, holding the Daredevil costume. Thankfully, she isn't dying. He kisses her and takes the suit from her. He thinks he would have had to wait longer, but Kingpin got sloppier much sooner this time. As the mayhem continues with Nuke exploding everything in sight, he finds himself bonked on the head with a billy club. As he takes another red pill and prepares for battle, we see on the last page of the issue, surrounded by a fiery inferno, Matt finally wearing his costume. Daredevil is back. American heroes. Hell's Kitchen is burning. People scream, there's fire everywhere. Sirens wail and bullets fly everywhere. In the midst of all this, Matt Murdock makes his first appearance as Daredevil after his home was destroyed. We learn that Nuke's been on too many amphetamines, but also that despite orders to retreat, he goes rogue and attacks Daredevil. Nuke employs heavy weaponry against Daredevil, who's deeply affected not just by the challenge of facing an inhumanly tough opponent, but also because of having to suffer through the maddening sounds of casualties caused each time Nuke's guns are fired. In the end, Daredevil defeats Nuke by thinking smartly. Instead of trying to land futile punches and kicks on him, he throws Nuke off a roof and into a live wire, electrocuting him. Then, as Nuke lands on a burning car, Daredevil jumps on him and lodges him in there. Soon, the car explodes and Nuke still comes out, covered in fire. Daredevil uses Nuke's gun to incapacitate him and, in an unusual gesture to stop the massacre, uses Nuke's weapon to destroy an assault helicopter that supported Nuke and threatened people, killing the pilot. The Avengers arrive on the scene, take Nuke into custody, and offer medical help to the injured, including Gloriana. Daredevil tries to get Nuke to admit Kingpin hired him, but he can't get a confession out in time. Later, the injured of Hell's Kitchen are being tended to in the church. Foggy and Matt arrive there separately and take care of their respective loved ones. Matt talks to Maggie as well, assuring her that he's okay. Soon, however, he senses trouble and leaves in a hurry, jumping and climbing his way onto a roof where Captain America is waiting for him. The captain isn't satisfied with the way things went down. Despite the police's claims that Nuke is a terrorist, the captain is skeptical, and now speaking with Matt, he learns that Nuke's body was full of plastics and was highly modified. As America's first super soldier, he's horrified to discover that the country's most recent super soldier appears to be a violent, muscle-bound, deranged man who has little concern for civilian lives. Back in Hell's Kitchen, Matt and Karen visit the destroyed diner owned by Bertha and Otto Schnapp. Matt suggests they could sue the government, but the old couple just wants to be left alone. Now that both Matt and Karen find themselves unemployed, Matt has a sneaky idea. Meanwhile, unsatisfied with Nuke's superior's evasive responses, he goes into the base's computer files to learn more about him. He turns out to be the lone surviving test subject of a botched attempt to duplicate Project Rebirth, the same project that originally upgraded his body and made him Captain America, the super soldier who won America the Second World War. Nuke, now enraged by the treatment he's received in the media, goes berserk and escapes from custody at the same base after taking a bunch of red pills. Kingpin, who's being felicitated at a ceremony as a respected man, hears about this escape and tries to contain it. Meanwhile, Daredevil takes money from certain bad men and funnels it into rebuilding the Schnapp's diner. He also learns that Nuke is on his way to the Daily Bugle. Nuke, on his way, is stopped by the captain, who keeps reminiscing about how optimistic things used to be back in the day, compared to how bleak they are now. He tries to get Nuke into custody so that he can help the man, but the military arrives and the Kingpin's men both try to murder him. However, despite being fatally wounded, Nuke doesn't die right away. Daredevil initially attempts to transport Nuke to a hospital, but after realizing that Nuke won't survive, he decides to transport him to the Bugle instead, in order to demonstrate that Nuke is a government operative and that his presence in New York is the result of the Kingpin's widespread military influence. Captain America covers this daring escape from afar, helping in his own way as much as he can. In the end, once the story about Nuke gets out and one of the hired hitmen corroborates it, Kingpin's public image as an honest and reputable businessman and community pillar is shattered, but he avoids prison for now while plotting his revenge on Matt. Matt, for his part, embraces and enjoys a new, different, but presumably fulfilled life in Hell's Kitchen with Karen Page, and he has no regrets about losing his old lifestyle as a successful lawyer. He reiterates his identity as a blind man who uses his other gifted senses to keep Hell's Kitchen clean as best he can. And in his own words, that's all you need to know. Marvelous verdict. Born Again is one of these classic Daredevil storylines written by Frank Miller that defines the character to this day. The artwork by David Mazzucchelli is often gritty, biblical, and noir-fueled. Rarely is it heroic, which makes those moments of heroism really pop. These are perhaps Matt Murdock's worst and best moments, as Miller strips him away to the bone and rebuilds him into a messiah of Hell's Kitchen. Kingpin is written as a formidable and cunning villain with a fatal flaw, which makes him deliciously appealing as the instrument of Matt's despair. It also makes Matt's journey of redemption and outsmarting Fisk that much more satisfying. There's perhaps no superhero with a bigger chip on his shoulder than Daredevil. He's blind, he's an Irish Catholic, and he's stuck being a lawyer. It's enough to drive anyone mad, but that's precisely why he's such a beloved character in the Marvel canon. Born Again uses all of that underdog energy and channels it to create a deeply scary man without fear. It's not because of the super heightened senses or the gravity-defying gymnastics that make Daredevil so relatable. After all, it's that anger within him that stands as a mirror for so many readers, and the fantasy of losing everything to the point where it can just be let out. Overall, Born Again is quintessential Daredevil reading for anyone who wants a touch of religious guilt and a hint of noir with their superhero in red tights. Daredevil Born Again, upcoming TV show. As for the upcoming show that borrows its title from this story arc, it's unclear as to how much the show is going to actually be about this particular plot. Fans might already be aware that Season 3 on the excellent Netflix series Daredevil adapted elements from this very arc, including the disappearance of Matt Murdock, his relationship with his mother, the imposter in the Daredevil costume, and the eventual return of Daredevil. So, since that's already been done before, we can only assume that Born Again won't be just a rehash of all of that. Since the Marvel Universe now wants to connect everything together with their multiple multiverse saga. Even the Fox, Sony, Netflix stuff is being slowly folded into the MCU. Most recently, we saw Charlie Cox return as Matt Murdock, Daredevil in Spider-Man: No Way Home, and Vincent D'Onofrio return as Wilson Fisk, Kingpin in the finale of Hawkeye. The two again reprised these roles in last year's Marvel Spotlight show Echo. This recent appearance on Echo might give us some clues to what Born Again could be about. The post-credit scene of Echo sets up Wilson Fisk as a candidate for an upcoming mayoral race in New York. Perhaps this could be the incident that brings Daredevil and Kingpin back face-to-face for another fight. Conversely, there are speculations that the show might also be about Murdock and Fisk having to put the differences aside and work together in order to stave off a bigger threat, or for the greater good. So, it could have more in common with a late 2010 storyline from the comics in which Fisk becomes mayor that concluded with the Devil's Reign event. We also know that the show recently went through a creative overhaul, and a lot of the story was changed and reshot. Part of this overhaul was also making it more in line with the Netflix show, which meant that there'd be returning characters from the Netflix show, including Foggy, Karen Page, Bullseye, and the Punisher. So, this show right now feels more primed to be a follow-up to the Born Again arc than an adaptation of it. Perhaps they could borrow elements from the last two issues with the Nuke storyline and modify it to fit Bullseye or the Punisher. Honestly, it could go either way, and maybe that's for the best. A straight-up Born Again adaptation would be quite hard to pull off anyway. Maybe in another universe it could have been Scorsese's follow-up to Mean Streets. But for now, we can only wait and hope for the best.